The scent of ozone and expensive cologne had long since been replaced by the acrid stench of gasoline and betrayal. Kang Ji-wook stood in the center of his crumbling sanctuary, listening to the heavy thud of tactical boots echoing through the hallway. These weren't the clumsy footsteps of rival street gangs. These were his own men, trained by his hand and paid by his blood. At the front was Minho, a lieutenant Ji-wook had raised from the gutters, now holding a silenced pistol with a gaze that held no room for sentiment. To them, the Iron Architect hadn't just weakened, he had committed the ultimate sin of the underworld. He had become a romantic. They saw his devotion to Thalassa not as a noble sacrifice, but as a terminal illness that threatened to take their livelihoods down with him. "You should have sent her away, Chairman," Minho said, his voice echoing in the hollow penthouse. The flickering emergency lights painted the room in staccato bursts of red. "The board doesn't want a martyr for a king. We want a boss who values the empire over a memory." Ji-wook didn't answer. He didn't waste breath on men who measured worth in territory rather than soul. He simply tightened his grip on the small tactical medical kit strapped to his waist and moved toward Thalassa. The first shot whistled past his ear, shattering a vase of dried gardenias, but Ji-wook was already in motion. He didn't reach for his gun. He reached for her. With a strength born of pure, adrenaline-fueled desperation, he scooped Thalassa's fragile form into his arms, tucking her head against the crook of his shoulder. He kicked through the side service door just as a flashbang detonated, the white-hot light blinding his pursuers for a precious heartbeat. He knew this building better than the men who were trying to kill him in it. He ignored the elevators, which were now death traps controlled by the security desk, and lunged into the concrete throat of the service stairwell. Behind him, he heard the roar of an incendiary device. The coup wasn't just an assassination, it was an erasure. His lieutenants were burning the tower to the ground to ensure that nothing of the Moretti Kang legacy survived the night. Smoke began to curl up the stairwell, thick and black, as the temperature rose with terrifying speed. Thalassa remained limp in his arms, her eyes wide and reflecting the orange glow of the encroaching fire. She didn't scream, but her fingers bunched into his shirt, a subconscious reflex that gave him the strength to keep descending. His lungs burned, and his muscles screamed as he bypassed the 40th floor, then the 30th, his boots pounding a frantic rhythm against the metal steps. The air became a soup of soot and heat. On the 21st floor, the door burst open, and a mercenary stepped out, but Ji-wook didn't stop to fight. He used his momentum to shoulder charge the man into the railing, hearing a sickening crack before continuing his descent. He was a force of nature, a man stripped of his titles and left with only the weight of his heart. By the time he reached the ground floor, the lobby was a war zone of shattered glass and licking flames. He burst through a side exit into the freezing Seoul night, the sub-zero air hitting his lungs like a spray of needles. He didn't look back as the Moretti Kang Tower, his life's work, and his gilded cage turned into a vertical funeral pyre against the winter sky. He staggered toward a nondescript black sedan hidden in a nearby alley, his shirt scorched and his hands bleeding from the glass. He placed Thalassa into the passenger seat with the tenderness of a man handling a dying ember. As he pulled away, the rearview mirror showed the silhouette of his empire collapsing in a rain of sparks. He had nothing left. No money, no men, and no home. He was finally just a man, driving into the darkness with a broken woman and a dream of a smile, while the world he built turned to ash behind him. The winter wind howled through the narrow, rain-slicked alleys of Seoul's underbelly, a place where the neon lights of the upper world never reached. In a basement apartment that smelled of damp concrete and copper, Kang Ji-wook stripped off his blood-soaked shirt. The reflection in the cracked mirror was no longer that of the Iron Architect. The sharp, tailored suits were gone, replaced by a nondescript black hoodie and tactical gear that had seen better days. His ribs were a mosaic of deep purples and angry yellows, a testament to the 3 weeks he had spent living as a ghost. He was no longer a man who moved pieces on a board. He was a man who broke the board across his knee. He looked over at the mattress in the corner where Thalassa lay, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket, her breathing the only steady rhythm in his chaotic world. To the public, the death of the Moretti Kang Empire was a headline that had already turned into yesterday's news. To the underworld, Ji-wook was a cautionary tale, a king who had lost his mind for a shadow. But in the darkness, Ji-wook was more dangerous than he had ever been as a CEO. He had spent the last fortnight hunting. The surgery required 3 specific components: a proprietary neural link chip, a stabilized dose of a synthetic neurotransmitter, and a localized EMP dampener to protect Thalassa's brain during the procedure. None of these could be bought with the money he no longer had. They had to be taken from the black sites and private laboratories he had once helped fund. He was a predator now, stalking the very shadows he had helped create, using the intimate knowledge of his own former supply chains to dismantle them from the outside. Tonight, he was after the neurotransmitter, held in a fortified clinic owned by a subsidiary of the Hwang Syndicate. He moved through the ventilation shafts of the facility with the silent grace of a man who had forgotten how to fear death. When he dropped into the laboratory, he didn't use a silencer. He used his hands. He was efficient, brutal, and terrifyingly fast. He moved with a singular, chilling purpose that unnerved the guards who tried to stand in his way. They saw a man with nothing left to lose, a creature who had shed his humanity to become a vessel for a single goal. He didn't steal anything else, not the cash in the vault, not the data on the servers. He took the small amber vial, tucked it into his vest, and vanished back into the night before the sirens could even begin their mournful wail. Returning to the safe house, he knelt by Thalassa's side. The adrenaline was still humming in his veins, but his touch remained as light as a summer breeze when he brushed a stray hair from her forehead. He was a nameless man now, stripped of his history and his pride. But as he looked at the components lined up on the scarred wooden table, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. A cold, hard certainty. He was the only person in the world who could save her, and he would do it by burning every bridge he had ever crossed. He checked his watch. The window for the surgery was narrowing. The Hwang Syndicate was closing in on his location, their scouts already sniffing around the perimeter of the district. He didn't care. He was a predator in a city of wolves, and he was finally ready to lead the lamb to the shore. The air at the Hwang Syndicate's mountain retreat was thin and tasted of pine and impending ozone. Kang Ji-wook stood at the center of a helipad, a solitary figure draped in a tactical coat that looked more like a shroud than a garment. In his arms he held Thalassa, her head lolling against his shoulder, her existence a fragile flame he was shielding from a hurricane. Surrounding them was a literal army, black-clad mercenaries with high-caliber rifles trained on his heart. At the top of the stone stairs stood Chairman Hwang, a man who had spent a lifetime trying to outbuild the Iron Architect. He looked down at Ji-wook with a mixture of triumphant malice and genuine bewilderment. He couldn't understand why a man who once held the keys to the city would stand in the snow, bleeding and broken, for a woman who didn't even know his name. "The surgeon is ready, Ji-wook," Hwang called out, his voice amplified by the cold mountain silence. "But the shipping routes weren't enough. The towers weren't enough. You have one thing left that I want, the location of the Ghost Reserve." The Ghost Reserve was the ultimate myth of the Seoul underworld, a massive, untraceable stockpile of gold and digital currency Ji-wook had salted away for a rainy day. It was enough to fund a private war or buy a small country. It was his final insurance policy, the only thing that ensured he would never truly be poor. Ji-wook didn't hesitate. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted drive, tossing it into the snow at the feet of the nearest guard. "The keys are on that drive," Ji-wook said, his voice a rasping blade. "Take it all. Every last gram of gold. Just start the surgery, now." Hwang gestured, and a team of medical orderlies rushed forward, taking Thalassa from Ji-wook's arms. For a split second, as her weight left his body, Ji-wook felt a chasm of vertigo, a sudden realization that he was now truly, utterly nothing. He watched them carry her into the high-tech medical wing, the doors sealing with a heavy, pressurized hiss. He turned back to face the army, his hands empty, his empire gone, his secret reserves surrendered. He was a man with no tomorrow, standing on a slab of concrete in the middle of a winter storm. "She has 1 hour," Hwang sneered, pocketing the drive. "After that, My men have instructions to ensure the Iron Architect never leaves this mountain. Consider this your final sunset." Ji-wook didn't plead for his life. He simply pulled a pair of serrated combat knives from his belt, the steel catching the dying light. He wasn't fighting to win anymore. He was fighting for time. He planted his feet as the first wave of mercenaries closed in, their orders clear. Kill the man, keep the money. The confrontation was a blur of silver and crimson. Ji-wook moved with a primal, desperate fluidity, a ghost haunted by the memory of a smile. He took hits that would have felled a lesser man, a shallow slice to his thigh, a blunt force trauma to his ribs, but he didn't falter. Every second he stayed upright was another second the surgeon had to reknit the frayed tapestry of Thalassa's mind. He was the dam holding back the tide of death, a solitary barrier between the woman he loved and the monsters who wanted his legacy. The snow began to fall in heavy, silent flakes, sticking to the blood on his knuckles. He was surrounded, a circle of steel closing in, but his eyes were fixed on the red light above the medical wing's door. He was a man who had traded a kingdom for a miracle, and as his vision began to blur from exhaustion and blood loss, he felt a strange, transcendent joy. He had nothing left to give, no secrets left to sell, and no titles left to defend. He was just a man holding a line, a predator protecting his mate. The dam was breaking, the weight of the army pressing against his chest, but as the red light finally turned to green, Ji-wook let out a ragged, triumphant breath. He had held on long enough. The price had been paid in full, and as he collapsed into the freezing white, he knew that for the first time in his life, he had won a war that actually mattered. The salt air was thick and sweet, a bracing contrast to the sterile, metallic scent of the mountain clinic that had nearly been his tomb. In a remote coastal cottage where the floorboards groaned with the weight of the tide, Kang Ji-wook sat by a bed draped in sun-bleached linen. The scars on his face had begun to silver, and his left arm hung in a heavy sling, a permanent reminder of the price he had paid on that helipad. He looked older, the Iron Architect, replaced by a man whose edges had been weathered down by grief and exhaustion. For 3 weeks, since the surgery had been completed, and he had dragged his broken body and his sleeping wife to this edge of the world, he had lived in a state of suspended animation. He didn't check the news. He didn't care that the Hwang Syndicate had been cannibalized by the very ghost reserve he had surrendered. He only watched the rise and fall of Thalassa's chest. The morning sun began to crawl across the room, illuminating the jars of sea glass and the simple wooden furniture. It was a humble life, a world away from the 60-story towers and the armored convoys. Ji-wook reached out with his steady hand, his fingers trembling only slightly as he touched the pulse point at her wrist. Suddenly, the rhythm changed. The stillness that had defined her existence for 3 years shattered like a thin sheet of ice. Her eyelids fluttered, struggling against the weight of a long, dark winter. Ji-wook held his breath, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his scarred ribs. He didn't move. He didn't want to startle the miracle he had bought with his own blood. Thalassa's eyes opened, and for the first time, they weren't the color of a frozen sea. They were deep, clear, and focused. She blinked against the golden light, her gaze wandering over the simple ceiling, the open window, and finally, settling on the man kneeling beside her. Ji-wook felt a wave of terror, a fear more potent than any he had felt facing an army. He was a stranger now, a battered ghost of the man she had once known. But as her eyes locked onto his, the fog he had fought for years finally pulled back from the shore. Her hand, once limp and cool, twitched on the linen, her fingers searching for his. "Ji-wook," she whispered. The sound was small, a fragile thread of melody that cut through the silence of the cottage. But to him, it was a symphony. It was the first time his name had been spoken with love in 1,000 days. She didn't ask where they were or what had happened to their empire. She simply looked at his battered face, her eyes filling with a sudden, radiant clarity. A small, tentative smile touched her lips, the smile he had burned a kingdom to see. It was a light that made the neon of Seoul look like dim, flickering embers. He leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers, his tears finally breaking free and soaking into the pillow. He had lost his shipping routes, his towers, his gold, and his reputation. He was a man with nothing but a cottage by the sea and a body that would never fully heal. Yet, as Thalassa's fingers curled around his, anchoring him to the present, the Iron Architect realized he had never been more powerful. The throne was gone, the crown was ash, and the world had forgotten his name, but he was no longer a predator wandering the shadows. He had traded a world of glass and steel for a single word and a radiant smile. He was no longer a king, but as the tide whispered against the shore, Kang Ji-wook knew he had finally, truly come home.